On a Tuesday morning in November of 2024, a woman named Nora Holt stood up in a courtroom in Harlan County, Kansas, and placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of a judge. The paper was yellowed at the edges. The fold lines had gone soft with age. It had been written by hand in November of 1981 by a man who had been dead for 35 years on the last afternoon of a career that had lasted 22 years. By a man who had understood something that morning that he wanted to make sure survived him. The opposing legal team had 3 rolling carts and 5 banker boxes, and a senior partner from an Omaha firm who had been closing pipeline corridor deals for 20 years. Nora had a manila folder and a cardboard box she had carried in from the back seat of her car. The courtroom smelled of old carpet and fluorescent light, and the particular institutional quiet of a room where serious things have been decided for a long time. The senior partner looked at the sheet of paper on the table. He picked it up. He read it once. He read it again. And in the careful, controlled expression of a man who has spent his career managing what his face shows in courtrooms, something shifted. Something that looked like the beginning of understanding arriving too late. 30 years earlier, a woman had paid $310 for the land this paper described. The company now sitting across the table from her daughter had paid $340,000 for information about that same land. The woman who paid $310 had found everything she needed in a public library in 1993 and 1994, in binders that had not been opened by anyone else in 40 years. The man who sold the $340,000 worth of information had never once set foot in that library. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because nothing about that courtroom morning was an accident. And the 30 years between that library and that table is the whole story. Her name was Della Holt. In the spring of 1993, when this story truly begins, Della was 28 years old. She was not a tall woman, not a loud one, not the kind of person a room organized itself around when she walked in. She was the kind of person a room forgot about until the moment it needed her, and then could not quite understand how it had managed without her. She had hands that showed what they had done. She had a face that had been outdoors for 28 years and had made no arrangements with the weather. She wore her late father-in-law's canvas work coat. In the cold months, the pockets shaped permanently by years of his hands going in and out of them. And she had a way of standing in front of a problem, a fence that needed mending, a set of numbers that did not add up, a sky that was reading wrong, that made you feel she was seeing something written on it that you did not have the eyes for. She lived with her husband Owen on 140 acres in Harlan County, Kansas land that Owen's father had broken in the late 1950s, and spent the next 30 years trying to hold together through drought, years in bad commodity cycles, and the particular grinding arithmetic of a small farm in the American plains, where the margin between a good year and a catastrophic one is often no wider than an inch of rain in the wrong week of July. Owen had inherited the land when his father died in 1991. He was 30 years old when that happened, and he had stepped into the responsibility of it, the way a man steps into deep water, knowing it is over his head going in anyway because there is no other choice, and because the land is worth it. Their daughter, Nora, was 8 years old in the spring of 1993. She had a particular quality of attention that made adults in the room occasionally feel they were being assessed by someone more patient than they were. She had her mother's eyes, the kind that did not miss much and did not volunteer what they had seen. Now, let me tell you about the letter. Because the letter is where everything starts, though, neither Della nor Owen understood that on the November evening it surfaced. Owen had been going through his father's things. Not the furniture, not the equipment. Those had been dealt with years earlier in the practical way of farming families, where nothing useful sits idle. What remained was a cardboard box that had been sitting on the top shelf of the hall closet since his father's death. A box of papers and cards and the accumulated documentation of a life. The kind of box that sits for years, because nobody wants to be the one to go through it. And eventually someone does it on a Tuesday evening in November with the house quiet and a cup of coffee going cold on the floor beside them. He found it near the bottom beneath a stack of Christmas cards that went back to 1974 and a folded county plat map from 1977 with coffee rings on the cover. A piece of paper folded twice along crease lines that had gone soft with age. The handwriting was not his father's. He did not recognize it. He read it once and understood the parcel number and most of the legal language and none of the significance. He carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table in front of Della. She was doing the farm accounts. The lamp was on. She had her reading glasses on the end of her nose. She looked up and he said simply, "I do not know what this is. You should look at it." She picked it up. She read it once. She went back to the top and read it again. Her hands were still on the table holding the paper. Owen was pouring more coffee at the counter. The house was completely quiet. She did not say anything for a long time, and Owen, who had been married to her for 9 years and understood the quality of her silences the way a farmer understands the quality of different kinds of clouds, did not push her. He brought his coffee to the table and sat across from her and waited. The letter was signed by a man named Earl Alderman. Della knew the name from the County Infrastructure Commission records she had been reading at the public library for the past 3 weeks. Earl Alderman had been the Harlan County infrastructure engineer for 22 years. He had retired on November 12, 1981. The letter was dated November 12, 1981. It bore the official stamp of the county engineer's office. He had written it on his last afternoon in the careful, deliberate hand of an engineer who spent a career writing things down for people who might need to read them 20 years later. It said, Parcel 77. Northern Agricultural Corridor, Harlan County, Kansas. This parcel contains the designated infrastructure easement corridor, established by Water Board resolution in 1968 and confirmed in the 1971 County Planning Report. Vacation of road right-of-way in 1981 does not affect corridor designation. Any subsurface installation crossing this parcel requires a recorded surface easement from the fee simple owner. This is not a road easement issue. This is a federal infrastructure corridor issue. See Army Corps Filing 1958 reference number attached. Below that, a reference number in the margin. An Earl Alderman's signature. And the stamp. Della set the paper down. She took off her reading glasses and set them on top of the accounts folder. She looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she looked at Owen. He said, "What is it?" She said, "I have been reading about Parcel 77W at the library for 3 weeks. And I think your father's friend just handed us something that nobody else in this county knows exists." Here is what she had been doing at the library. It starts in November of 1993, a month before Owen found the letter on an evening when Della drove to the Harlan County Public Library, because the walls of the farmhouse had started to feel smaller than they used to, and she needed to think somewhere that was not inside her own 4 walls. The library was a single-story brick building on the main street of town that smelled of carpet and paper, and the particular institutional quiet of a building that takes its purpose seriously. The reference section was in the back. The librarian on duty that evening was a woman named Agnes, who had worked there since 1971, and who believed that the answer to every question a person could have in Harlan County was somewhere in the building, if they were willing to look for it. She showed Della the county commission binders without being asked. She had seen the look on Della's face before. It was the look of a person who does not know exactly what they are looking for, but is certain they are looking for something real. The binders were sorted by year along a back shelf. The checkout cards inside most of them had fewer than 3 names across 4 decades of sitting on that shelf. Della pulled the 1960 volume and worked forward. She almost skipped 1968. The cover was water-stained at the bottom right corner. She opened it to the middle out of habit. She read page 47 once, then went back to the top and read it again. Harlan County Water Board Engineering Commission. Annual Report, 1968. Northern Agricultural Basin Corridor Survey. Natural Grade Assessment. Footnote 7 was 3 sentences long. It described a natural drainage corridor crossing the northern parcels of the county agricultural basin. It noted that this corridor remained on the county books as a designated infrastructure easement zone that had not been vacated or dissolved. It noted that any subsurface installation crossing parcels within the designated zone required a recorded surface easement agreement from the fee simple owner of the relevant parcel. She read footnote 7 4 times. She came back on Thursday and pulled the 1969 Road Commission records. She found the County Infrastructure Planning Report from 1971. She found a 1981 Road Commission vacation order and read it 3 times, confirming that the vacation applied only to road construction purposes and did not dissolve the drainage and infrastructure corridor designation established by the Water Board. She spent 40 minutes with a county plat map confirming where Parcel 77W sat relative to the natural grade described in the engineering documents. The natural grade ran directly through Parcel 77W at its narrowest point, 11 feet 9 inches wide, crossing 340 yards of the only viable subsurface installation path in the entire northern basin. The 1968 engineering report had used a word she had underlined with her fingernail and read 3 times. The word was unique. She understood what that word meant in the context of infrastructure planning. Unique did not mean special. Unique meant irreplaceable. Unique meant there was no other route. She put all of it in a folder she kept in the truck. She paid 20 cents per page at the library photocopier. She drew a rough map of the corridor from memory on a sheet of notepad paper and traced the county parcels from what she remembered. She was not certain of every detail. She was certain enough. She came home on the 3rd Thursday and spread the map on the kitchen table, and Owen came in from the barn and stood in the doorway looking at it without asking a question, waiting for her to explain when she was ready. When Owen found the alderman letter a month later, and Della read it at the kitchen table under the lamp, what she felt was not triumph. It was the particular settling of a thing that has been working itself toward resolution for a long time and has finally arrived at the shape it was always going to take. Earl Alderman had been the county engineer. He had read the Army Corps filing from 1958. He had understood the corridor designation in its federal dimension. He had written the letter on the last afternoon of his career because he was the kind of man who made sure the right information was in the right hands before he walked out the door for the last time. He had given it to Owen's father because Owen's father had been a careful man who kept things other people threw away, and Earl Alderman had known that about him. Owen stood at the counter with his coffee and looked at his wife sitting under the lamp holding a letter written 42 years ago by a man he had met twice. He said, "Does this mean what I think it means?" She said, "It means more than either of us can see right now, which is exactly why I'm going to make a copy of it and put the original somewhere safe." She went and got a clasp envelope from the drawer beside the stove. She held it open, and Owen understood without being told that what went into that envelope was the original, and that the original would not leave the house again until the day it was needed, and that she would know which day that was when it came. She put the envelope in the kitchen drawer beneath the extra dish towels. She had been married to Owen long enough to know where things needed to be kept, to survive a farm household across decades. The dish towels were where you put the things that mattered. In April of 1994, Della drove to the county seat for the annual tax auction. She had been once before the previous spring just to understand the room, to understand how it worked, to look at the parcels list and know the faces. She had not bid on anything that first time. She had just watched. She had learned a long time ago that most rooms reveal themselves completely if you sit in them quietly for long enough. The basement of the county courthouse held folding tables pushed together in a rough rectangle, a card table with a coffee pot that had been sitting since 7 in the morning, and approximately 30 people in the rows of metal chairs that the county clerk's office had set out the night before. Patrice Weston, the county clerk's deputy, was already at the front table with her stamping kit and her folder of parcel sheets. She had done this auction 11 times. She had the particular calm efficiency of someone who has done the same important thing enough times that the importance no longer makes her nervous. Della took a chair in the back row. Warren Cobb came in 4 minutes later. You need to know Warren Cobb. He was 50 years old that April. A big-shouldered man with the ease of someone who had been right about enough things for long enough that being right had started to feel like a permanent condition rather than an outcome that required continued effort. He ran the largest agricultural lending operation in 3 counties from an office on Main Street that had his name on the window in gold letters. He wore a watch on the outside of his shirt cuff, a habit he had picked up from a banker in Wichita in the 1970s and had never examined. He carried a leather portfolio. He spoke briefly to 2 men near the front before taking a seat where he could see everything. He did not look at Della when he came in. Della looked at Cobb. Patrice began calling parcels at 8 in the morning. The room had the flat energy of people who had already made up their minds about most things. Parcels went quickly. A few drew counter bids from men who had spoken outside before coming in. Most settled within 2 bids. Nobody was surprised by anything for the first 40 minutes. Parcel 77. BU came up near the end. Patrice read it without inflection. 36 acres northern agricultural corridor, no road access, of record unimproved back taxes, owed $450. The room did not move. Warren Cobb leaned toward the man beside him and said not quietly enough, "Marsh ground. Worthless." He said it the way a man says something he has settled in his mind so completely that saying it out loud is simply a formality. The man beside him nodded once. Della raised her hand. $310. Cobb looked over. He had the particular smile of a man who has just watched something enter the wrong room. Patient. Slightly amused. Not threatened in any way. He looked at Della the way you look at something that is not a serious participant in a serious setting. He did not counter. He turned back toward the front. Nobody countered. Patrice said, "Sold 36 acres northern corridor to the woman in the back row. $310. She stamped the deed transfer and slid it across the table. Della signed it in her careful, even hand. She folded the receipt once along the center and put it in the inside breast pocket of Owen's canvas coat. Cobb had already gathered his portfolio. He did not look at her again. Della drove home on the county road. Owen was in the kitchen when she came in. He saw her face and knew the broad shape of what had happened before she said a word. She set the folded receipt on the table between them. He looked at it for a moment without picking it up. Then he said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I am sure about what it can become. I'm not sure about when. Those are 2 different things." He picked up the receipt. He held it. He set it back down. He did not say anything for a little while. Then he said, "All right." And that was the whole conversation. That was the whole agreement. Two people at a kitchen table with the late afternoon light coming through the window. And 30 years of what came next still ahead of them, and not one word of it visible yet. Nora was 9 years old. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing her homework when her mother came in. She watched her mother set the folded receipt on the table and her father pick it up and set it down. She did not ask what it meant. She had learned early that some things her parents discussed were fully explained if you waited patiently enough, and some things revealed themselves in a different way through action, rather than explanation through what happened over months and years, rather than what was said in any single evening. She went back to her homework. She stored the image of that receipt on the table the way she stored other things she did not yet have a category for in the back of her mind, in the place where she kept things that she knew without being able to say why were going to matter later. In the fall of 1994, Della paid the back taxes, $450 by check, mailed to the county treasurer's office on the 14th of October. She wrote the date and the amount in the small green notebook she had bought at the hardware store and kept in the truck. She filed the receipt in the back pocket of the notebook. She drove out to the parcel on a Saturday morning with Owen and 9-year-old Nora and a surveyor's tape she had borrowed from their neighbor, Dale Fuqua. She walked the boundary herself. Owen walked beside her. Nora walked behind them both, stepping carefully in the tall grass, watching her mother move. At the narrowest point of the natural grade, Della stopped and stretched the tape and recorded the measurement in the notebook, 11 feet 9 inches. She wrote the date and the weather condition and the condition of the marker stakes, which she had cleared with a brush knife from the ragweed and volunteer sumac that had grown over them. Nora watched her mother write in the notebook and then look up at the flat Kansas sky the way she looked at things she was thinking about carefully. Then Della capped the pen and put the notebook in her coat pocket, and they walked the rest of the boundary. On the way back to the truck, Nora walked beside her mother and said, "Is this worth something?" Della looked at the parcel, then at her daughter. She said someday. Nora accepted this the way she accepted most of what her mother told her, completely, and without requiring more. They drove home. The marker stakes stood in the November light behind them, cleared and visible, holding the boundary of a thing that most of the county had already decided was worthless, and that one woman had driven to the library 4 times in the dark to understand. In the spring of 1995, Della mailed $45 in property taxes on parcel 77W. In the spring of 1996, she mailed $45. She recorded each payment in the green notebook with the date and the check number. The receipts went into the back pocket behind a rubber band she replaced every few years when the old one cracked. She walked the boundary twice a year, spring and fall, clearing the marker stakes herself, measuring the narrowest point with the surveyor's tape she had eventually bought from Dale Fuqua for $8 when he retired his equipment. She wrote the measurements in the notebook, 11 feet 9 inches. Season after season, the same number, the land holding what it had always held. She went back to the library in the spring of 1996 and pulled the 1975 through 1985 county infrastructure filings, looking for anything she had missed. She found 2 additional references to the Northern Corridor designation and 1 reference in a 1983 budget memo that described the corridor as a protected infrastructure zone of record. She copied all 3 pages and filed them in the notebook. She wrote in the margin 6 documents now from 6 separate agencies on 6 separate occasions, all saying the same thing. Nobody has put them in the same room yet. I have. She kept the notebook on the shelf above the kitchen desk between the 1991 tax returns and a seed catalog from 1989. Owen knew it was there. He trusted the process. the way he trusted the land, not because he could see every part of it, but because he had learned that some things unfold on their own schedule, and the only error is to interrupt them. The property tax on Parcel 77W sat in a sealed envelope on the counter every December, addressed to the county treasurer, mailed on the 14th. Every year without exception. The land held, and so did the woman who kept reading it. The years that followed were not dramatic years. They were the kind of years that do not announce their importance while they are happening, years of early mornings and cold Decembers, and the particular mathematics of farming in the Kansas plains, where a good year and a bad year can look identical from the outside until the harvest comes in. Della paid the taxes on Parcel 77W every December, and walked the boundary every spring and fall, and kept the notebook current, and said almost nothing to anyone about any of it. Owen knew. Nora was beginning to understand. Everyone else in Harlan County had already forgotten the 36 acres of marsh ground in the northern corridor existed. That was exactly how Della needed it to be. In the summer of 1997, a man came to the door on a Thursday afternoon. He was in his mid-30s, pressed shirt, khaki pants, a clipboard with a company logo that Della read upside down while he was talking. He introduced himself as a representative of a land services company with clients interested in agricultural parcels in the northern corridor. He said his clients had identified Parcel 77W in their research. He said they were prepared to offer a fair price for unimproved land with no road access. He said the way you say a number, you expect to change everything in a room. $8,500. Della looked at him. She had been paid $8,500 once before in her life for a piece of equipment she had sold at a farm auction in 1991. That had been a tractor attachment in good working condition. This was 36 acres of marsh ground that she had paid $310 for 3 years earlier, and that had no road access and no improvements of any kind. Someone was prepared to pay $8,500 for it, and delivering the offer as if she should be grateful. She thanked him for making the drive. He left a business card on the porch rail. She brought the card inside and wrote the date and the number and the company name in the green notebook. Then on the line below she wrote, "They know something. $8,500 is not their ceiling. They do not yet understand enough to know what their ceiling actually is. Neither offer nor accept anything until you understand more than they do." She called Owen in from the barn and showed him the entry. He read it and looked up and said, "How much more do they know?" She said, "Enough to find the parcel. Not enough to know why it matters." He said, "And how much do we know?" She said, "Everything that is written down, which is more than they have found." That was the whole conversation. Owen went back to the barn. Della put the notebook on the shelf and went to finish making dinner. Nora was 12 years old that summer and was sitting at the kitchen table when her mother came back in from the porch. She had heard the conversation with the man at the door through the screen. She looked up from her book. She said, "Are you going to sell it?" Della said, "No." Nora said, "Why not?" Della said, "Because the price tells you they want it. And when someone wants something that badly, the number they start with is never the number they end with." Nora went back to her book. She stored that answer the same way she stored everything her mother said. In those years, not in a place she could retrieve immediately, but in a place that would open up later, when the context finally arrived to explain it. 4 years passed the way farm years pass, in the plains full of weather and work, and the steady arithmetic of seasons. The Land Services Company did not come back. The November tax payment went out every December. The boundary walk happened every spring and fall. The notebook stayed on the shelf. In the fall of 2001, a different man came to the door. He was older than the first one, late 40s, a sport coat that had been dry cleaned recently. His business card said, Northern Plains Land Partners, LLC, with an address in Wichita. His name was Holloway. He said his company was conducting a regional land assessment and had identified Parcel 77W as potentially relevant to future infrastructure development in the corridor. He said potentially twice. He said his company was authorized to offer $14,000 for unimproved land with no road access, and that this reflected a substantial premium over assessed value. Della said, "How long is the offer open?" Holloway said 60 days. Della said, "I appreciate you coming out." Holloway left. Della went to the library that evening and looked up Northern Plains Land Partners in the Kansas Secretary of State corporate filings. The company had been incorporated in March of 2001. Its registered agent was a law firm in Wichita. Its stated purpose was agricultural land acquisition and infrastructure consulting. She wrote the law firm name in the notebook. She wrote Company Incorporated 8 months ago. Someone with resources organized this entity specifically for corridor acquisition. The offer is $14,000. In 1997, it was $8,500. The number is going up. The urgency is going up. Whatever they are assembling, they have not finished assembling it. She drove home on the county road in the dark. She was 36 years old. Nora was 16 already. The kind of student who read things twice and asked questions that made her teachers pause before answering. Owen was 38, steady in the way that good men are steady present, in a way that did not require announcement. That night at the kitchen table, Della told Owen about the library and the incorporated company and the number going up. He listened to all of it with the particular attention he brought to conversations he understood were important. When she finished, he said, "So someone is building something out there in the northern basin, and they cannot finish it without this parcel." She said, "That is what the numbers suggest." He said, "And they do not know you know that." She said, "No. They think they are offering a fair price to a farmer with marsh ground she cannot use." He looked at the kitchen table for a moment. Then he said, "All right." The 60-day window closed. Holloway did not call back. Then the drought came. It had been building since July of 2003. The way droughts build in Kansas. Not as a single event, but as a slow withdrawal of something you had come to depend on. A degree at a time, a week at a time, a field at a time. Until one morning in August you stand at the edge of the cornfield, and the tassels are wrong, and you understand that the year is already decided, and the decision is not in your favor. By September, the corn in the south fields had come in at 58 bushels per acre, against a break-even of 91. The bean fields were better, but not enough better. Owen and Della sat at the kitchen table in November, with the farm financial statements spread between them, and the particular silence of two people who are looking at the same numbers from two different angles and arriving at the same conclusion. The operating line at the county savings bank was drawn down to $10,800. The equipment payment was due in January. The mortgage had come down over 9 years of careful management, but it had not come down far enough to give them room. The numbers on the table told a story that neither of them wanted to read, but Della had learned from her father-in-law's careful habits and from her own years of keeping the farm accounts that the numbers you refuse to look at are the ones that eventually look at you. 2 weeks into December, a man named Carson knocked on the door. He was from a company called Midland Resource Group, based in Kansas City. He said his company had been conducting geological and infrastructure surveys in the northern corridor. On behalf of a private client he was not authorized to name. He said his company had determined that Parcel 77W had significant strategic value to their client's long-term development plans. He said his client had authorized him to make a cash offer of $82,000. No contingencies, no financing. Clean title transfer in 10 business days. I'm tired. He said, $82,000 the way you say a number. You expect to change everything in a room. Della looked at him from the doorway. She said she would think about it. He left the purchase agreement on the porch rail and said the offer was open for 30 days. She brought the agreement inside and set it on the kitchen table and left it there. Owen came in from the barn at 6 in the evening and saw it lying there and did not pick it up. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at Della's place and sat down across from her. The kitchen light was on. Outside, the December dark had settled over the fields and the county road and the 36 acres of marsh ground in the northern corridor that a company in Kansas City was prepared to pay $82,000 for. $82,000 would cover the operating line. It would make the equipment payment. It would take the pressure off the mortgage balance and give them room to breathe through the following year and the year after that. It would make the letter from the bank irrelevant. It would make the winter shorter and the arithmetic on the kitchen table look like a different story. Della reached across and picked up the purchase agreement. She held it in both hands for a long time. Owen sat across from her and did not say anything. The kitchen was quiet except for the furnace and the sound of the December wind coming down from the north. He did not push her toward the agreement, and he did not push her away from it. He sat with her in the difficulty of it the way a person sits with someone they love. In a room where the decision is genuinely hard, and there is no version of the conversation that makes it easy. She set the agreement down. She got up and went to the shelf above the kitchen desk and took down the green notebook. She brought it back to the table and opened it to the page where she had listed all 6 documents in their order. She read the list. She read the notes beneath it. She read the entry from 1997 and the entry from 2001. The number is going up. The urgency is going up. Whatever they are assembling, they have not finished assembling it. From 1997 to 2001, the number had gone from $8,500 to $14,000. From 2001 to 2003, it had gone from $14,000 to $82,000. The gap between the second offer and the third was not a modest increase. It was a number that had changed its character entirely from a land value offer to something that was trying to solve a problem. She looked at Owen. He was looking at the notebook. She said, "I need to make a phone call in the morning." He said, "All right." She called the county savings bank the following morning and asked for an appointment. She brought the farm financial statements and a 3-year projection she had drafted by hand the night before, and the deed to the 140 acres, and the deed to Parcel 77W. She sat across from the loan officer, a man named Griggs, and explained the drought year and the operating line balance and what she expected the coming year's numbers to look like. She was calm and precise, and she did not apologize for any of the numbers because apologizing for numbers you did not create is a waste of the time you need to explain them. Then she said, "I have a parcel in the northern corridor that I purchased in 1994 for $310. I received an unsolicited cash offer of $82,000 for it 2 weeks ago. I have not accepted the offer. I want you to understand that the asset exists." She put the deed to Parcel 77W on the desk. She put the tax receipts behind it, 9 years of payments in chronological order, every one on time. Griggs looked at the deed. He looked at the purchase price. He looked at the offer amount. He picked up the deed and set it back down. He said, "You were offered $82,000 for land you bought for $310. Della said yes. He said, "And you turned it down." She said, "I did." He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man rearranging something in his understanding of a situation. Then he said he did not think they had a collateral problem after all. He extended the operating line for 12 months. Della drove home on the county road. The 30-day window on Carson's offer expired in January of 2004. Carson did not call back. She wrote in the notebook, "Offer expired. They will return. The parcel does not disappear," because the offer did. That spring, she went back to the library and spent a Saturday afternoon in the federal documents section. She found the Army Corps of Engineers Corridor Survey from 1958 in a thin gray binder with a government seal on the cover that had not been touched since it arrived. The survey identified the Harlan County Northern Basin as containing a natural infrastructure corridor of federal interest, established a designated zone along the natural grade, and noted in the formal language of the Corps that any subsurface installation crossing the designated parcels within the zone required a recorded surface easement from the current fee simple owner. The language was nearly identical to what Earl Alderman had written in his 1981 letter. On the last afternoon of his career, Alderman had read this survey. He had understood it in its full federal dimension. He had written his letter because he wanted to make sure that understanding survived his retirement in a form that a future owner of the parcel would be able to use. Della sat at the third table from the window in the Harlan County Public Library for a long time after she finished reading. She did not write anything in the notebook for 2 full minutes. She just sat with both hands flat on the table and looked at what she had found and understood what it meant in its complete shape for the first time. She made copies of the relevant pages at 20 cents each. She put them in the notebook behind the photocopy of Earl Alderman's letter. She wrote on the notebook page, Army Corps 1958, Alderman 1981 Road Commission, 1969 Water Board, 1968. 4 separate documents from 4 separate agencies, all saying the same thing. 6 documents total, counting the 1977 planning report and the 1983 budget memo. Nobody has connected all 6. I have. The land is waiting. She closed the notebook and drove home. Nora was 19 years old that spring, finishing her first year at the University of Kansas in Lawrence on an academic scholarship that she had applied for herself without asking her parents to help with the forms, because she did not want them to take time away from the farm to help her with paperwork she could manage on her own. She called home on Sunday evenings. She asked real questions about the farm and expected real answers. She did not ask about the notebook. She had known about the notebook since she was 12 years old, had watched her mother write in it at the boundary of Parcel 77W on a November Saturday, and had asked if the land was worth something. She had been carrying the answer someday for 7 years. She was patient enough to keep carrying it. The years between 2004 and 2014 were years of maintenance, full of work that does not announce its importance while it is happening, but without which nothing that follows is possible. Della farmed the 140 acres with Owen paid down the mortgage, kept the parcel 77W taxes current, walked the boundary twice a year, kept the notebook. She added 3 more documents to the file over that period. A 2004 State Utility Corridor Report, a 2007 Federal Pipeline Siting Study that mentioned the Harlan County Northern Basin by name as a preferred corridor for transmission infrastructure, and a 2009 County Planning Memo that referenced the Northern Corridor designation in a footnote that most readers would have skipped. She added each one to the notebook with a dated entry explaining its relevance. The file was now 9 documents from 7 agencies across 6 decades. Every one of them said the same thing in different language. Every one of them was available to anyone willing to drive to the library and sit down with the binders. Nobody had. Nora graduated from the University of Kansas in 2007 with a degree in political science and went directly to law school at the University of Chicago. She graduated in 2010 and joined a real estate law firm in Chicago, where she spent her first 3 years learning the particular language of easement disputes and infrastructure corridors, and the ways that large companies acquire land for projects that require federal permits. She was good at it in the way that people are good at things they were prepared for before they knew they were being prepared. She called home on Sunday evenings. The farm, Owen, the November tax payment, the boundary walk. She asked about the notebook, sometimes indirectly through questions about how the parcel was described in the county records, whether anything had changed in the assessor's files. Della answered the questions plainly. Nothing had changed. Everything was current. The land was holding. In the fall of 2014, a man named Howard came to the door on a Wednesday morning. He was in his mid-50s, a geological engineer by the look of him. The kind of man who has spent a career doing subsurface surveys and carries the evidence of it in the way he looks at the ground when he walks. He said he was working on a corridor assessment project for a private client whose name he was not at liberty to share at this stage. He said he needed temporary survey access to the northern edge of the 140-acre parcel, which abutted the county road along the south boundary of parcel 77W. Della said you can access the county road from either end. You do not need my permission for that. Howard said the survey point I need is on your property. Just a few hours. I can show you the coordinates. Della said I am not interested in providing access to my property without knowing who your client is. He said he was not authorized to share that. She said, then I am not in a position to help you. He left a card. She wrote the name and the date in the notebook. She wrote Independent Geological Engineer Corridor Assessment. Undisclosed client needed survey access to the south boundary approach point for parcel 77W refused. He wants to know what is under the ground at the natural grade crossing. Someone sent him to find out without telling him enough to tell me. The corridor is being studied again. She called Nora that Sunday evening and described the visit. Nora was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was moving information into a useful order. She said, I will look into geological survey firms in Kansas that do infrastructure corridor work. Give me a few weeks. 3 weeks later, Nora called back and said that Howard was associated with a consulting firm that had done subsurface work for pipeline companies across the Central Plains and had recently been active in Kansas and Nebraska on corridor feasibility studies. She said whoever sent him does not have enough information yet to know what they are actually looking for. They are trying to find it. Della wrote this in the notebook and set it back on the shelf. Outside the kitchen window, the November sky was flat gray. The 36 acres of marsh ground in the northern corridor sat in the dark beyond the county road, holding 11 feet 9 inches of irreplaceable natural grade, holding the corridor designation that Earl Alderman had written down on the last afternoon of his working life, holding everything it had always held patient and indifferent and completely unaware of being looked for. In March of 2019, a woman named Patricia Sloan drove to the Holt farm in a black sedan and knocked on the door at 9 in the morning. She was in her late 40s, a senior land acquisition attorney with the particular composed efficiency of someone who has closed difficult transactions in difficult rooms for a long time and has learned to read the situation in the first 30 seconds of entering it. She carried a leather briefcase and wore a coat that had not been bought on a farm supply budget. She represented a company called Meridian Pipeline Group based in Tulsa. She had driven from Wichita that morning. Della poured 2 cups of coffee and set them on the kitchen table and sat down and waited. Sloan opened her briefcase and laid out project maps. The pipeline corridor, 79 miles, federal permits pending total project investment, $2.1 billion. She said all of this in the measured cadence of someone who has said it many times and knows which numbers people pay attention to. Then she said, Meridian was prepared to offer $175,000 for parcel 77W clean title transfer, no contingencies, 60-day close. She said it was a generous offer for unimproved land with no road access. Della drank her coffee. She said, "That is a generous offer." Sloan said, "We believe it reflects the parcel's real strategic value to the project." Della said, "I am not interested in selling." Sloan looked at her with the professional composure of someone who had been told by her research that this answer was likely and had prepared accordingly. She said Meridian hoped to resolve the acquisition amicably and that the offer carried a 60-day window and that she was available to discuss terms if Della had concerns about the structure. She drove away down the county road. Owen came in from the equipment shed 20 minutes later and found Della sitting at the kitchen table with the project maps Sloan had left behind spread open in front of her. He sat down across from her. She looked at the maps for a long time without saying anything. He waited. She said, 79 miles, $2.1 billion, federal permits pending. He said, "How long have they been planning this?" She said, "Long enough that pending means they filed, which means there is a record somewhere." She drove to the Harlan County Courthouse the following Tuesday morning and spent 3 hours in the Easement Records Office going through the Northern Corridor parcel filings. She found what she was looking for in an October 2018 filing. Meridian Pipeline Group had submitted a corridor easement application for the Northern Basin transmission route to the Federal Permitting Authority. The application described a right-of-way through the Northern Corridor parcels, including Parcel 77W. It described the easement as encompassing the full natural grade crossing. It listed all relevant parcels as part of the corridor acquisition. It did not include a signed easement agreement from the fee simple owner of Parcel 77W. Where a signed agreement should have been there was a notation. It said, "Easement acquisition in progress." Della sat in the courthouse records room and read that notation 4 times. Easement acquisition in progress. They had filed a federal corridor application describing a right-of-way through land she had not signed anything to give them. They had submitted paperwork to a federal agency treating her agreement as a formality that would be resolved before anyone looked closely. They had built their permit application on an assumption. The assumption was that a woman with 36 acres of unimproved marsh ground in the Northern Corridor would eventually take a reasonable number. They had been so certain of it that they had filed first and planned to buy second. She wrote every detail in the notebook: the filing date, the application number, the exact language of the notation. Then she wrote they filed the federal application without my agreement. They assumed acquisition was inevitable. They assumed the offer would be sufficient. They built their permit on an assumption. The assumption is wrong. She drove home and called Nora that evening. She told her about the visit, the maps, the offer, and what she had found at the courthouse. Nora listened to all of it without interrupting. When Della finished, Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been building a file on Meridian for 4 years. I started when Howard came to the door in 2014. I did not tell you because I did not want you to feel like I was managing the situation from Chicago. I was not managing it. I was preparing for it." Della said, "What does the file show?" Nora said that the natural grade crossing at Parcel 77W is not one parcel among 12 in their land assembly. It is the parcel without which the other 11 are substantially diminished. The core filing from 1958 identified that crossing as unique. Their own geological survey from 2014 confirmed it. Their federal application was structured around it. They cannot reroute. The terrain does not permit it without a cost that would threaten the project economics. Della said, "How long have you known that?" Nora said, "Long enough that I have already drafted 3 versions of what comes next. None of them involve selling." Della sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she hung up. Owen came in and she told him about the courthouse filing and the notation and what Nora had said. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he got up and went to the kitchen drawer. and moved the dish towels aside and took out the clasp envelope. He set it on the table between them without opening it. He said, "I think it is probably time to make sure Nora knows about this, too." Della looked at the envelope. She said, "I never forgot it was in there." He said, "I know." She said, "I just did not know which day it was going to matter." He was 60 years old that evening, and there were things in his face that had not been there when he was 30. The particular settling of a man who has watched someone he loves carry something heavy for a very long time and has never once asked her to put it down. He said it might be getting close. She picked up the envelope. She held it for a moment. She set it back down on the table and left it there in the middle of the kitchen table in the light, waiting for the day that was coming. 5 years is a long time to carry something you cannot yet use. Della did not think of it as waiting. She thought of it as the same thing she had been doing since 1993. Keeping the record current, walking the boundary, paying the tax. Trusting that the land was telling her something true, and that the day would come when the room was finally ready to hear it. Nora in Chicago built her file the way her mother had built hers, document by document in careful order without announcing it. The two of them were doing the same work from different distances the way a fence line holds, even when you are only tending one end of it. The day announced itself on a Tuesday morning in March of 2024 at 6:52. Della was standing at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee, watching the light come up over the north field. She had been watching survey crews work the northern boundary for 11 straight mornings. White trucks with the Meridian Pipeline Group logo on the doors, orange flags moving in systematic lines across the frozen ground. Men in high-visibility vests working with the methodical patience of people who have already decided the outcome and are simply filling in the physical details the decision requires. They came at 7 and left at 4 and did not look toward the farmhouse. Della watched them every morning with her coffee going warm in her hands. She had been watching the same kind of patience for 30 years. She recognized it from the inside. The phone number on the screen was not one she recognized. She let it ring twice. She set her coffee cup on the counter. She picked up on the third ring and said nothing. The voice belonged to a man named Gordon Watts. He said he was sorry to call so early. He said he was lead counsel for Meridian Pipeline Group's Land Acquisition Division, and that his client had authorized him to place a revised offer on the table for parcel 77W. He said the offer was significantly above anything previously discussed. He said the federal permitting window for the corridor application was closing in 18 days, and that his client was highly motivated to resolve the matter before that deadline. Della said how motivated. Watts said $580,000. Clean transfer, no contingencies, 30-day close. She looked out the kitchen window at the orange flags in the north field. From 1997 to 2003, the number had gone from $8,500 to $82,000. From 2003 to 2019, it had gone from $82,000 to $175,000. From 2019 to this morning, it had gone from $175,000 to $580,000. The number had been telling her the same thing for 27 years, and it was telling it louder now than it ever had. She said, "I will call you back." She hung up. She finished her coffee standing at the window. She rinsed the cup and set it in the drying rack the way she did every morning, regardless of what the morning contained. Then she went to the shelf above the kitchen desk and took down the green notebook and sat at the kitchen table and opened it to the current page. She wrote the date and the time and the name Gordon Watts and the number $580,000 and the phrase permitting window 18 days. She looked at what she had written for a moment. Then she called Nora. Nora picked up on the second ring. Della told her about the call. The number. The 18 days. Nora was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was arranging information. Then she said, "I am coming Saturday." Della said, "I know." She arrived at 11 in the morning in the practical sedan with the cardboard box in the back seat that she had been filling for 5 years. She carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen table next to the green notebook. She took off her coat and sat down. Owen brought coffee. Nobody spoke for a few minutes. It was the particular quiet of a room where people are about to do something they have been preparing for without quite naming it. Della opened the notebook to the current page. Nora opened the box. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, Owen refilling coffee cups, the kitchen light steady over the table, the Kansas. March dark settling outside the windows. Nora went through the Meridian federal permit application twice. She cross-referenced the parcel assembly timeline with the corporate filings and the LLC registration dates. She had been tracking Meridian's land acquisition activity since 2019, building a record of which parcels they had acquired, through which entities in what order. The pattern was clear. They had assembled 11 parcels in the northern corridor over 5 years, working east to west through the basin in the methodical way of a company that knows what it is building toward. Parcel 77W was the last one. It was the one they had come to last because it was the one they expected to be easiest. The unimproved marsh ground with no road access, owned by a woman who had been paying $45 a year in property taxes for 30 years. Then Nora found the amendment. She had been looking for it for 4 months. She had known from the pattern of Meridian's legal filings that they were preparing a contingency in case the offer failed. The amendment was filed in June of 2023 at the Harlan County Records Office. It was a routine administrative correction request, the kind that gets approved without examination if nobody objects within 30 days. Nobody had objected. Nobody had been watching for it except Nora, and she had found it 3 weeks after it was filed, but had said nothing, waiting to see how Meridian used it. What the amendment did was remove the infrastructure easement corridor notation from the parcel description for parcel 77-W in the county records. The original county description, going back through every recording since 1968, had included the waterboard corridor designation as part of the parcel's legal description. The 2023 amendment replaced it with a standard unimproved agricultural parcel designation, as if the corridor notation had never existed, as if it were simply a recording error being corrected, rather than a fact being erased. Nora set the amendment document on the table in front of Della. She said, if this stands, they will use it in an abandonment action. They will argue that the parcel has been held for 30 years with no improvements and no commercial use, that the corridor designation is a historical artifact without current legal force, and that the public interest in completing a $2.1 billion natural gas transmission project serving 4 counties justifies an involuntary easement. Without the original corridor notation in the county record, their argument is much stronger. Owen said, "Can they do that?" Nora said they filed the abandonment action last week. So, yes, they are doing it. Della sat with that for a moment. 30 years of tax payments, 30 years of boundary walks, 30 years of careful entries in the green notebook, a $580,000 offer on the table with an 18-day window, and behind all of it, a company that had filed a federal permit application on her land without her agreement, and had then quietly erased the legal designation that explained why her agreement was required. She said, "Owen." He was already up. He went to the kitchen drawer and moved the dish towels aside. He brought the clasp envelope to the table and set it in front of Della. She did not open it yet. She held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it. Then she looked at Nora. She said Earl Alderman wrote this on the last day of his career. He stamped it with the county engineer's seal. He gave it to your grandfather because your grandfather was the kind of man who kept things that careful people wrote down. I have had it in that drawer for 30 years. I have known since the November evening your father brought it to me from your grandfather's box that it was the foundation under everything. I just did not know which morning I was going to need to put it on a table. She handed it to Nora. Nora opened the clasp and took out the letter. She read it once. She went back to the top and read it again. She set it on the table and looked at her mother. She said they filed the amendment in 2023. This letter was written and officially stamped in 1981. You cannot claim a recording amendment corrects a historical error when the official county engineer documented the designation as valid and intentional 42 years before the amendment was filed. Della said that is what I thought too. Nora said the abandonment argument rests entirely on the premise that Parcel 77W is ordinary unimproved land with no special designation of record. This letter, written by the person holding the county engineer's office on the date of his retirement, establishes that the corridor designation was real, deliberate, federally grounded, and legally binding. Their whole case depends on the court not knowing this letter exists, Owen said, but the court is going to know. Nora looked at her father. She said, yes, it is. She picked up the letter and held it carefully in both hands. In the 5 years she had spent building the file in Chicago, learning easement law, tracking Meridian's acquisitions, preparing for a day she could feel coming, without being able to name it. She had always known that the foundation of everything was a document she had not yet seen. Her mother had told her it existed when Nora was in her first year of law school, had described it without producing. It had said simply, when the time comes, you will have what you need. Nora had trusted that the way she trusted everything her mother told her completely, and without requiring more. Now she held it in her hands and understood why her mother had kept it in the kitchen drawer for 30 years and had never doubted for a single day that the day would come. She made a photocopy that night at the library down the road, the same library where Della had first opened the water-stained binder in 1993. She put the original back in the clasp envelope. Della put the envelope back in the kitchen drawer under the dish towels, because that was where it lived, and that was where it would remain until after the matter was closed. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in October of 2024 at the Harlan County Circuit Court. The courtroom was small by the standards of the work that happened in it. 3 rows of gallery seating, a raised bench, fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly more tired than it was. The Meridian legal team occupied the left side of the counsel table. There were 3 of them, 2 associates and a senior partner named Whitmore from an Omaha firm that had been handling infrastructure corridor acquisitions for 20 years. They had 3 rolling carts and 5 banker boxes stacked to the left of the table, and the particular settled confidence of a legal team that believes the outcome is already decided and is simply executing the formality of the hearing. Nora sat on the right side of the counsel table with a manila folder and the cardboard box. Della sat beside her. Owen sat in the first row of the gallery directly behind them. He had his hands folded in his lap and the particular stillness of a man who has waited a long time for something and has decided not to spend the last part of the waiting in any state other than calm. Whitmore opened for Meridian. He was precise and unhurried, and he had done this many times. He said the case was straightforward. He said Parcel 77W had been held under single ownership since 1994, with no improvements, no structures, no recorded commercial activity, no agricultural activity, no evidence of engagement with the property beyond the annual payment of a nominal tax assessment. He said that under Kansas, marketable title provisions, a parcel held in this manner for 30 years without active use or development could be subject to an abandonment determination that would extinguish the owner's right to contest infrastructure easements serving the public interest. He said the 2023 County Record Amendment confirmed the parcel's unimproved and undesignated status. He said his client had made multiple fair market offers over a period of more than 20 years and had been refused without explanation. He said the public interest in completing a 79-mile natural gas transmission corridor serving 4 Kansas counties and several 100,000 residents was a compelling factor in the court's consideration. He sat down. Nora stood up. She said she had 3 documents to present to the court and that she would be brief. She placed the first document on the table in front of the judge. She said, "This is the original deed transfer for Parcel 77W executed April 14, 1994. Signed by Della Holt, stamped and recorded by the Harlan County Clerk's Office on the same date. Purchase price $310. The parcel has been under continuous single-owner title for 30 years without interruption. Lien encumbrance or adverse claim of any kind." She placed the second document on the table. She said these are the property tax receipts for Parcel 77W for every year from 1994 through 20C. $2445 annually paid by check. Never late, filed in chronological order. The County of Harlan has accepted payment and issued receipts every single year for 30 consecutive years. Kansas courts have consistently held that a taxing authority cannot simultaneously accept payment on a property and sustain an abandonment claim against the paying owner. If this property had been abandoned, the county would not have continued to tax it. The county taxed it every year. That is 30 years of acknowledgement by the same government, whose records opposing counsel has been citing that this property was actively owned and not abandoned. She heard one of the Meridian associates lean toward Whitmore and say something quietly. She did not look at them. She placed the third document on the table. She said, "This is a letter written by Earl Alderman, Harlan County Infrastructure Engineer, dated November 12, 1981. Mr. Alderman served as county engineer for 22 years and retired from that position on November 12, 1981. This letter was written in his professional capacity on the date of his retirement and bears the official stamp of the county engineer's office. In it, Mr. Alderman describes Parcel 77W as a designated infrastructure easement corridor established by Water Board resolution in 1968 and confirmed in the 1971 County Planning Report. He states explicitly that the vacation of road right-of-way in 1981 did not affect the corridor designation. He states that any subsurface installation crossing this parcel requires a recorded surface easement from the fee simple owner. He cites the 1958 Army Corps of Engineers corridor survey by reference number. She paused. She said the county record amendment that opposing counsel introduced was filed in June of 2023. The letter I have just placed before this court was written and officially stamped in November of 1981. It predates the amendment by 42 years. It predates by 17 years the earliest filing in opposing counsel's exhibit list. You cannot claim that a designation was administratively corrected in 2023 when a document written and stamped by the county's own engineer in 1981 confirms the designation was valid, intentional, and legally binding. The 2023 amendment does not correct an error. It attempts to erase a fact. There is a difference. She sat down. The courtroom was quiet. Whitmore had picked up the third document from the table. He was reading it with the careful attention of a man who has just found something he did not know existed and is rapidly revising his understanding of the situation he is standing in. He set it down. He looked at it. He picked it up again. One of his associates was already on a phone turned slightly away from the table. The two of them exchanged a few quiet words that had the tight, compressed quality of people managing an emergency in a room where they cannot raise their voices. The judge looked at the Meridian counsel table. He said, "Mr. Whitmore, your abandonment argument rests substantially on the assertion that Parcel 77W carries no special corridor designation of record. Is that a correct characterization of your position?" Whitmore said, "That was our position based on the current county records, Your Honor." The judge said, "Based on the current county records." He looked at the alderman letter. He said, "This document bears the official stamp of the Harlan County Engineer's Office, dated November 12, 1981. Written by the person holding that office on the date of his retirement. It describes a specific legal designation for a specific parcel with a specific reference to federal authority." "Were you aware of this document prior to this morning?" Whitmore said. "We were not, Your Honor." The judge set the letter down. He looked at it for a moment longer. Then he looked at Nora. He said, "You are representing the fee simple owner of the parcel in question." Nora said, "I am, Your Honor. I am also her daughter." He said, "And the owner has been in continuous possession current on all taxes for 30 years. Nora said, "Yes, Your Honor. Every year, every payment, every receipt." The judge ruled in 4 minutes. He said the abandonment claim was not sustainable under the evidence presented. He said the 1981 document established a clear and official corridor designation that was not extinguished by the 2023 County Record Amendment, which he described as an alteration of record that would require separate examination by the county attorney's office. He said the fee simple owner's rights to the parcel and to the corridor designation within it were intact. He dismissed the abandonment action. Whitmore was on his phone before the gavel came down. His two associates were already repacking the banker boxes with the focused efficiency of people who need to be somewhere else as quickly as possible. The rolling carts moved toward the door. The room began to rearrange itself around the fact of what had just happened. Della sat at the counsel table and did not move. Owen had stood up from the gallery bench the moment the judge spoke. He was standing directly behind her now, his hand resting briefly on the back of her chair, not touching her shoulder. Just present the way he had always been present, close enough to feel without requiring acknowledgement. She could hear him breathing. She had heard that same breathing beside her for 31 years across drought, years and good years, and the particular winters that tested everything a farm and a family could hold. She sat still for another moment and let the room do what rooms do when something long contested is finally settled. Then she picked up the green notebook from the table where she had set it that morning and put it in her coat pocket and stood up. Nora touched her arm briefly and then began putting papers back into the box with the efficient focus of someone already thinking about the next step. She was 39 years old, and she had been building toward that morning since she was a 12-year-old girl, walking a boundary line in the November grass and asking her mother if the land was worth something. Gordon Watts called Nora's phone at 4 in the afternoon. He said his client was prepared to discuss easement terms. His voice had the flat, controlled quality of a man who has spent the day adjusting to something he did not expect and has arrived at a professional equilibrium that is costing him effort to maintain. Nora said she had already drafted the terms. She told him, "A permanent surface easement 60 feet wide along the northern natural grade of parcel 77W. Monthly payments of $5,100 adjusted for inflation every 5 years at a rate tied to the Consumer Price Index. The agreement fully transferable to Della Holt's heirs in perpetuity. No buyout clause, no expiration date, no termination provision for any reason short of physical destruction of the natural grade which the easement agreement itself would prohibit Meridian from causing." Watts said the monthly payment structure is unusual for a corridor easement. Nora said it is the structure my client is offering. Watts said the inflation adjustment compounds significantly over a long term. Nora said that is the point. He said he would need to consult with his client. He called back in 2 hours. Meridian accepted the terms. Nora called Della from the courthouse parking lot. She said we got it. All of it. Della said good work. She hung up. Owen came in from the barn that evening and she told him about the call and the terms. He sat down across from her. He looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Then he got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat back down. And that was how they spent the evening, 2 people at a kitchen table in the Kansas dark drinking coffee, not needing to name what the day had been. That night, Owen went out to the barn, not because anything needed doing, because he needed to be somewhere that was not the kitchen for a little while, somewhere with the smell of hay and old metal, and the particular quiet of animals settling for the night. He stood in the middle of the barn floor and looked at the 1978 Ford tractor that his father had driven, and that he had driven since he was 19 years old. The bank had once come close to taking it. A drought year. A deficiency letter a December when the numbers on the kitchen table told a story he could not fix. Della had fixed it. She had walked into a bank with a deed that said $310 and a declined offer that said $82,000. And she had fixed it without asking him to do anything except trust her. He had. He always had. He stood in the barn for a while in the dark and did not say anything to anyone. Then he went back inside, and the kitchen light was on, and Della was at the table, and that was enough. The signing was held at the Harlan County Clerk's office on a Thursday morning in November of 2024, the same building where Patrice Weston had stamped the deed transfer 30 years before. The same county records room where Della had stood at the counter in 2019 and read the corridor easement application, with the notation that said, "Easement acquisition in progress." The notary set up her kit. The Meridian associate produced the signed easement agreement, 12 pages tabbed for signatures in 5 places. Watts was not present. He had sent the associate and the notary and a professional courtesy that did not require his personal attendance. Della read the agreement from the beginning. She was not a fast reader. She was a careful one. It took her 16 minutes. Nora sat beside her and said nothing. Owen sat in the chair against the wall with his hands in his lap. The clerk waited with the particular patience of someone who has witnessed the resolution of long contested things before, and understands that the last moment before signing deserves its own time. Della signed in 5 places. The notary stamped each page. The clerk filed the original. The transaction took 12 minutes from the moment Della picked up the pen. She walked out to the truck and reached into the inside breast pocket of Owen's canvas coat, the coat she had worn since his father died in 1991. The coat whose pockets had been shaped by 30 years of her hands, going in and out of them with notebooks and receipts and folded deed transfers and tax envelopes. She took out the original receipt from April 14, 1994. The paper had gone soft at the fold line from 30 years of being opened and looked at and put back. She held it in the November light for a moment. Then she opened the green notebook to the last page and wrote 2 lines. The first said the land held. The second said, so did we. She closed the notebook. Nora came out of the building and stood beside her at the truck. She looked at the notebook in her mother's hands. She said, "What did you write?" Della opened to the last page and turned it toward her. Nora read it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is enough." Della said it always was. They stood there for a while in the November light. The 2 of them, the woman who had sat in the library in 1993 and the girl who had walked the boundary in 1997 and asked if the land was worth something. The answer had taken 30 years to become fully legible, but the answer had been there from the beginning in footnote 7 of a waterboard report from 1968, in the careful handwriting of an engineer on the last afternoon of his career, in the green notebook on the shelf above the kitchen desk, in the clasp envelope beneath the dish towels, in every $45 tax payment mailed on the 14th of December, in a sealed envelope for 30 consecutive years. Now, let me tell you what the discovery process revealed, because there was one more thing the story had not yet shown, and it arrived the way the truest parts of long stories arrive, not with announcement, but with the particular quiet of a fact that has been waiting patiently for the room to be ready to hear it. In the months following the October hearing, the judge's order regarding the 2023 county record amendment prompted an examination by the county attorney's office of how the amendment had been filed and on whose behalf. The examination opened a chain of document requests that eventually led back through a Wichita consulting firm to a man named Warren Cobb. Warren Cobb had retired from agricultural lending in 2012. In the years since, he had been doing what men like Warren Cobb do when they find themselves with time and contacts and a need to feel consequential. He had been consulting. In 2013, he had been approached by an infrastructure planning firm working on behalf of early-stage pipeline development in the Kansas Northern Basin. He had been asked to provide what the firm called corridor intelligence, meaning detailed knowledge of which parcels in the northern agricultural corridor were strategically critical, who owned them, what their acquisition history was, and what price points might be persuasive. Cobb had recognized the geography immediately. He had been in Harlan County for 30 years. He knew the northern basin. When the consulting firm described the natural grade crossing and the unique designation, he said he could help. He spent 2014 assembling a geological and infrastructure profile of the northern corridor. He hired Howard to do the subsurface survey work that Della had refused him access to perform. Howard had surveyed the county road approaches and produced a corridor feasibility assessment that confirmed what the Army Corps filing had said in 1958, that the natural grade crossing at Parcel 77W was irreplaceable. Cobb had delivered this assessment to the consulting firm, and from there to Meridian Pipeline Group in 2019, shortly after Patricia Sloan's first visit to the Holt farm. His invoice was on file in the LLC transaction records that Meridian was required to produce in the discovery process. The amount was $340,000. The description read, Corridor Intelligence Services, Northern Basin Land Assembly, Harlan County, Kansas. Nora found it on a Tuesday evening in her Chicago office, going through the third box of discovery documents. She sat with it for a long time. Then she called Della. She told her the number. Della was quiet. Nora said, "Do you understand what he sold them?" Della said, "Tell me." Nora said he sold them the geological assessment from Howard. He sold them the parcel identification. He sold them the corridor intelligence that told them Parcel 77W was the bottleneck. He had Howard do the survey work in 2014, and then he sold the results to Meridian after their offer failed in 2019. He sold them a roadmap to your front door for $340,000. Della said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I paid $310 for the land. He sold the information about it for $340,000. Nora said yes. Della said, "And he never knew what was in the library." Nora said he knew the parcel had value. He knew the corridor mattered. But he sold the location without understanding the foundation. He identified the target without knowing why the target was legally unassailable. He charged $340,000 for intelligence that pointed Meridian at your front door, and still could not tell them why the door would not open. Della sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she hung up. Owen was in the other room. The house was quiet. She went to the shelf and took down the green notebook and carried it to the table. She opened it to the last page, where she had written the 2 lines at the county clerk's office. Below them, she wrote 2 more. The first said, "Warren Cobb was paid $340,000 for information I found for free in a library in 1993. I paid $310 for the land that held it." The second said he bought what he was told. I read what I found. There has always been a difference. She closed the notebook and sat with it in her hands for a moment, feeling the weight of 30 years of careful entries. Then she put it back on the shelf between the 1991 tax returns and the 1989 seed catalog she had never thrown away. She went to the drawer and moved the dish towels aside. She took out the clasp envelope. She opened it and took out the alderman letter, the original, the one with Earl Alderman's signature, and the county engineer's stamp, dated November 12, 1981. She looked at it for a moment, thinking about a man she had never met, who had sat at a desk on the last afternoon of his working life and written down the truth of something he knew was going to matter to someone he would never know. He had stamped it with official authority. He had given it to Owen's father because Owen's father was the kind of man who kept what careful people wrote down. She folded it carefully along its original crease lines and put it back in the envelope and closed the clasp. She put it back in the drawer under the dish towels. Its work was done. That was where it lived, and that was where it would stay. Warren Cobb read about the easement agreement in a 3-paragraph article on page 6 of the Harlan County Courier in December of 2024. The article did not name the landowner. It did not describe the terms. It said only that Meridian Pipeline Group had finalized the last outstanding land acquisition in the Northern Basin Corridor, and that construction was expected to begin in spring. Cobb read it at his kitchen table in Wichita with his morning coffee. He had been in this county for 30 years. He had known the Northern Corridor. He had been paid $340,000 to know it. He set the paper down and looked out the window for a while at nothing in particular. He thought about a basement room in April of 1994, a card table with a cold coffee pot, folding chairs in rows, a parcel he had called worthless out loud, in a room full of people who had agreed with him. He thought about a woman in the back row who had raised her hand and paid $310 for something he had already decided was not worth the trouble of understanding. He had not thought about that morning in a long time. He thought about it now. He picked up the article and read it once more. Then he set it down and got up and washed his cup and went to find something else to do. Some understandings arrived too late to be useful for anything except carrying. He would carry this one. There was nothing else to do with it. In the spring after the signing, Della went to the west corner of the 140 acres. The corner that abutted the county road along the south boundary of Parcel 77W. She brought 12 bur oak saplings in plastic pots in the back of the truck, bought from a native plant nursery in the next county. She had ordered them in January and driven to pick them up herself in February when the ground was still frozen, keeping them in the equipment shed under a grow light until the soil was ready. Bur oak is a Kansas native. It grows with the particular deliberate slowness of something that has decided depth matters more than height, establishing its root system across decades before it commits seriously to anything visible above the ground. A bur oak planted by a 59-year-old woman in the Kansas spring will not provide meaningful shade in her lifetime. She will see it as a sapling and as a young tree, and perhaps as a tree beginning to find its form. She will not sit beneath it. Della knew this. She planted them anyway, one at a time on her knees in the spring soil, spacing them the way the county extension guide said. To space them, leaving room for what they were going to become across a time she would not live to see. Owen came out at mid-morning and watched her from the fence line for a while without saying anything. Then he came through the gate and knelt down beside her and held the next sapling steady, while she worked the soil around the roots. They planted all 12 together. Nora drove down from Chicago the following weekend and walked out to the west corner to see them. 12 small trees in a row along the fence line, each one with a wooden stake beside it, and a label tied with green garden twine. She stood and looked at them for a long time. Della came out and stood beside her. Nora said, "You know you will not be here to see them full grown." Della said, "I know." Nora said, "Then why?" Della looked at the young trees. She said, "Because your grandfather kept a box of papers from a man named Earl Alderman. And Earl Alderman wrote down the truth on the last day of his working life. And your father found the paper in the box and brought it to the kitchen table. And I read it under the lamp and understood what it meant and kept it in a drawer for 30 years. She looked at Nora. None of those people planted something they expected to harvest themselves. They planted it for whoever came after. Nora looked at the 12 saplings standing in the Kansas spring light, small and serious, deep in the patient work of putting down roots before they committed to anything the world could see. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "What do I do with the notebook?" Della said, "You keep it. You write down every tax payment and every boundary walk and every offer and every conversation that matters. The same as I always did." She looked at her daughter. She said, "Because the land keeps its own books, Nora. Every document, every entry, every $45 check mailed on the 14th of December is a deposit into something that does not show on a balance sheet. The whole world is going to spend the rest of your life trying to tell you that the valuable thing is the number on the offer, the check, the settlement, the amount on the closing statement." She folded Nora's hands around the green notebook and held them there, her worn hands over her daughter's. She said, "But the real asset was never the parcel. It was never the $310 or the $580,000 or any number in between. The real asset is the knowing. The knowing what to do with a water-stained binder that nobody has opened in 40 years. The patience to sit at the third table from the window and read footnote 7 4 times until you understand what the word unique actually means. The willingness to keep the books faithfully for 30 years because you believe the land is telling you something true even when the whole county has already decided the land is worth nothing." She let go of Nora's hands. She said, "Everything else is just a temporary number, and numbers change. The land holds." They walked back up to the house together in the spring light. Owen had coffee ready. The notebook went on the shelf above the kitchen desk where it had always lived between the tax returns and the seed catalog from 1989. The clasp envelope was in the kitchen drawer under the dish towels. The 12 bur oaks were in the ground along the west fence line, small and quiet, and committed to a depth of time that no living person in that household would see the end of. The $45 annual tax bill on Parcel 77W was already sitting in a sealed envelope on the counter addressed to the Harlan County Treasurer, waiting for the 14th of December. It would go out the same as always. It would be paid the same as always. Some habits are not broken when the reason for them resolves. Some habits are the reason. Some things last not because they are defended loudly, but because someone somewhere is paying quiet attention, walking the boundary twice a year, keeping the notebook current and mailing the envelope on the 14th. Not because anyone is watching, because the land deserves it, because that is what careful people do.